G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic Friday and a great end to your week. Now yesterday afternoon I saw my oncologist and he is happy with me to start the chemotherapy whenever I choose to. So I'll be starting that tomorrow evening. So over the next week or so I may miss a couple of days and I apologise for that. But it's good to know that my blood results are looking fairly good 8 months into the treatment. Now, legends, of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over. So we're going to be looking at, of course, maps and geolocations. We're going to look at drone manufacturing and strikes and a new glide bomb entering the battlefield. We need to talk about corruption, what Zelensky has made new moves on this anti-corruption lockdown. We're going to then go further on Zelensky and his head of the president's office, Andriy Yermak. And we're going to speak further on that and this slide, this centralization slide to authoritarianism that we are seeing, and many people are putting up warning flags at the moment, and how so many decisions are made by a very small group, even you could argue a shadow president in some ways, and that massive amount of influence. And of course, it's why people are protesting on the streets, with the investigation body of corruption then being looked over by internal, what would I call it? Internal affairs at best, investigation and intelligence and security services at worst with those arrests. So we'll go over that. We'll go over freedom of speech, influence, a bit of everything too. So let's start with drones and strikes folder here. So we have seen a new fab glide bomb. Now, there are many different types of glide bombs. We use that as an umbrella term, but what we know is that there are some extended range variants, and today is no different. So this then, say 34 kilometers behind the Russian-Ukraine border, has struck in Kharkiv, and the reports are that Russia has used a new UMPB-5, an extended range glide bomb, for the first times, and the claim is that it struck an industrial enterprise near this residential complex. And by the satellite imagery, we see this residential complex and it struck this building here. Exactly what was there? Well, we don't know. Of course, you get mixed reporting from both sides. Some will say it was merely a civilian residential house, and then others will say it was producing systems. Again, in an all-out war like this, we do not know, and it can be very dangerous to speculate on, because at the end of the day, what is considered dual use, what is considered a target, if you're producing drones in your bedroom of a complex and it can be struck, there is no better example of this than the NCV rates we see that maybe Israel will be working with, and what's dual use and what can be targeted. But I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in this weapon, and this is said to be what it is, the UMPB, the D30SN bomb that has a 250 kilogram warhead, but also carried by the Su-34. Interestingly, on this, it says it can be fired off a Smerch or Tornado S, so it must have some level of booster that may then jettison off to fire from there, but mostly from those Su-34 aircrafts. And Noah reports, he has reported on this, saying, "We've struck Kharkiv with a new type of new munition, the UMPB-5 glide bombs now launched from 100 kilometers away and carry a 250 kilogram warhead with a heavier casing than the earlier D30 variant." So we know that Kharkiv Prosecutor's Office has spoken about this weapon before, but they're saying it's a new one again. Now, there was a little bit of a panic overnight. We do know that Ukraine is very, very reliant on Starlink, and this is a huge vulnerability. Now, Deep State and many others reported that fighters say that all the Starlinks went down, and it looks like Starlink had a worldwide outage for a few hours and then it was back up. Exactly what the cause of this is, well, we are unsure, but if this went down, things could go sideways very quickly. So let's talk about drones and manufacturing, and what I showed you in the last few days was that factory in Russia just absolutely pumping out the Garan drones. Now, this doctoral research fellow works, of course, at major think tanks. Fabian Hoffman has tweeted this and copped a lot of criticism for it. And as soon as I saw it, I thought the exact same thing. Share the video and says even though Russia is clearly mass producing its Garan 2 drones, they are still essentially assembled by hand. There is no proper rolling assembly line, no robotic automation. Russia never developed this type of industrial base and isn't building it now. This places tremendous strain on manpower, both within and beyond its defence sector, and remains highly inefficient. Now, this may be so in different markets, but different markets have incredibly expensive labour, also don't need to be as flexible or are privatised. But wait until, Mr. Hoffman, that you find out where the most drones are assembled and made, especially things like the FPVs. But then how do you explain that Russia is outproducing the West in many, many weapons, from drones to artillery to tanks, by many factors? And Russia has a lot of cheap labour, and we see that unemployment is at record lows. Of course, this can be very, very flexible as well with strikes taking place. And Russia's industry is public, it's not privatised, and it is optimised for high output, low cost. The Soviets was the exact same. And that can, of course, have an impact on the absolute high end of systems, but it is for then producing mass, which we have very, very rudely seen that we can't develop mass. And this comment here sums up very correctly. First of all, this is wartime production. Who the hell spends massive amounts of money on complex automated manufacturing processes in the middle of a war when it's only needed temporarily? And you may remember probably 18 months ago, I spoke to a gentleman, and I shared it on here, who works for I don't want to say too much, but a manufacturing plant in Europe who make very, very high-end parts for some very unique weapon systems that are operated in Western militaries. And they work with a lot of lathes and 3D tech. And he said the problem is, to develop any of this, we need to have highly, highly skilled people, and we need to buy all these new machines, but it's only needed temporarily too. What then we do after the fact? That's why we're having problems with mass. He reached out to me working in the industry and just gave a breakdown of why producing mass in the private system is very hard. And he continues on this. When it's needed temporarily and no money is being made from the product, it's not like it gets sold on the market, it's a one-way item. In Russia, the military-industrial complex is not privatised. It's part of the military. The priority is to be as cheap, fast and efficient as possible. Profit is not the goal. And this is where you get the R&D and those super high-end systems in the Western private systems, but struggle to produce mass, because profit for Lockheed, for Boeing, etc. is the goal. Second, the building those overpriced production machines can just get bombed and destroyed. Manufacturing processes have to be simple and flexible as possible. And the only way to do that is with human factor. And if you set up a massive plant with machines, with automation, etc., and that gets bombed, that's all gone. Humans, of course, far more flexible, far more survivable. They carry the knowledge and can move plant to plant. NATO needs 3 to 5 years to produce the same amount of ammo, shells, rockets, tanks, and drones. And so, on that, Russia churns out in just 3 to 6 months. And we have seen NATO even speak about this. Where's the inefficiency in that? And this is how, reading through different comments and talking to other people behind the scenes, this is exactly how you produce items like that. You don't do it via automation. So let's have a look at the maps. And we are fairly short on maps today, but here, of course, is Ukraine in the centre of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupies since 22, the purple since 2014. This map hasn't updated today, but typically the red check, that would be showing advances. But I have some geolocations and some other maps to show where there may be advances. So let's come into the northeast of the country and talk about Kupiansk, the island boys of Kinrashivka. Of course, we've seen the grey zone grow in here, and Suryak and others speak about more than gains in here. But let's have a look at a geolocation today. So I'll actually show you this part first. We see a Ukrainian drone then targeting this building here with Russian forces inside of it. But we then look at the geolocation of this, and this is in between then Hulubivka and Radkivka, right down in around where my cursor is as well. And many Russian pages today are suggesting that DRG elements have entered Kupiansk, and we do know that they are right out into these sectors, right out on the very outskirts, so they could slip in, just like we have seen in Pokrovsk, and that starts a whole bunch of issues. But we do know 100% you're not firing a drone at nothing in that building, and we know what it then saw. DivGen Map, he shares this, and you can get an idea of where the Oskil is running down in here. You can sort of get the shape and right down, including into these buildings. He's showing that this is filling in as well, all the way through to Kindrashivkia coming under control as well. So likely advance and at very least more grey zone expansion in that area. Now let's move our way down to Seversk, and somewhere we have spoken about a lot that is starting to move after years of not moving. And we see what I spoke about before between Verkhonomansky and Seversk, open, flat ground. And what we shared about a month ago was Russia using a lot of resources to target these first buildings along here. And today is no different. At this geolocation, here are multiple geolocations around Seversk. What we can see is from a drone very zoomed in. Sorry, that's incredibly loud. Let me go back. We can see multiple then bombs targeting here. Now, I believe these are FABs, but I am unsure. My initial thoughts was this was TOS, but it doesn't look like it because we only saw 3 come in. Could be FAB 250s or 500s, but targeting that outer edge of Seversk. So wait out on that. Now let's move our way down into, of course, Pokrovsk, where all eyes should be. But a lot of eyes are getting diverted away because they don't want your eyes to be seeing the deteriorating, catastrophic situation that is developing here. So let's firstly have a look at some then geolocations right on the eastern flank. The developed eastern flank of Pokrovsk now become the western flank of Donetsk. And we have Yamblanivkia in here. Of course, expanding this has then made a desaturation of offensive weapons back so you can move in logistics more easily to expand your flanks and reach. So we have in Yamblanivkia approximately at these 2 locations in here at 240 and 255, some Russian flags going up. So right in here, just outside of the grey zone. I'll pull up this video and we will scroll through. Remember, I'm not interested in things going bang. I'm interested for the battlefield effect of it. So we have this guy then climbing this here, and the next one is at too far, 255. We have another flag going up there, confirming advancement into these areas. But let's look at Pokrovsk itself and see where things are then moving. So the eastern flank has both the eastern and western side, and on the western side of it, or the eastern side of Pokrovsk, I know that can be confusing, we have this from DivGen Map, that this Novokonomaenchny has come under complete control, including then pressure on some of the defensive lines in here, right down through Mykolaiivkia as well, outside of the grey zone on here. Wait out for further confirmation on this, but it makes sense of where then Russia will be pushing as it hooks around on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, aiming to reduce potential and increase the attrition rate. Now we know near Zerozove as well as Pershetravneve, this is likely the area that those Russian DRG elements got into Pokrovsk on. That DivGen today, he's showing in this sector, we can see this road hooks around, and then we have, this is the reservoirs that are sitting just in here, these 2 reservoirs right here. He's saying all of this is coming under Russian control. Again, we won't confirm it off the information we have presented, but it does make sense. And if we were to use Occam's razor of where have the Russians been pushing, how much ground have they been made, it seems highly likely. So let's have a look at some of this. So we have seen, and one of my predictions for the year is we're going to see more and more friction between the US and Europe. We see a French official page then put up this, and I believe this is to do with Candace Owens and then Brigitte Macron's husband, wife, whatever you would want to call it. But again, I do not care if Brigitte Macron is a he or she. I couldn't care less. What I do care about is this complete cover-up of it being a pedophile. It was a teacher, 39, and he was 14 or 15. You have a president of an incredibly liberal state who is a legit, his wife is a legit, imagine if that was the other way. What the fuck? But then this, we're getting off in the weeds. In Europe, one is free to speak, not free to spread illegal content. The problem is they are determining what is legal, what is illegal, what is right, what is wrong. Of course, you can add a lot of nuance to this. And the Department of State US, they have basically reshared this, and they've said in Europe, thousands are being convicted for the crime of criticising their own governments. This Orwellian message won't fool the United States. Censorship is not freedom. And this is from the Digital Services Act, saying the DSA protects its European leaders from their own people. Of course, this requires in social media sites to remove content that it basically doesn't agree with or sees that is incorrect. But again, the problem is, who is determining whether this is right or wrong? Look at the spicy flu a couple of years back and how just incorrect that what was considered outright conspiracy, wrong, shut down, arrested, all of this, and then what it has swung around to become. And there's a very, very dangerous slide that we are seeing. We see Mr. Jake Bro, a fellow YouTuber, sharing this. YouTube has removed nearly 11,000 channels and other accounts tied to state-linked propaganda campaigns from China and Russia. Thanks, YouTube. YouTube wipes out thousands of propaganda channels from CNBC. What I would like to see is either there's everything or you apply evenly across. And I'd love to see YouTube remove all state-backed propaganda, regardless of the state, regardless if it is the US, it is the European Union, whether it's Australia, whether it is whoever, that remove anything that is state-backed pushing propaganda, because what you end up with is a vacuum on the other side, which we have got. And I'll be very, very interested to see, once the money falls away from the propaganda and the war ends, what becomes of a lot of people on these websites and their audiences and engagement, etc. We know a lot of that is playing a huge factor in this. I spoke with mathematicians at a university studying this. Sadly, the first time they ever did an interview, they got attacked so badly from the audience that they refused to do anything more public. And speaking of stay back, let's have a look at this. And Cumberland Reports has said this: people keep asking why I don't continually cover the protest in Ukraine. And the main reason is that this is internal politics and inappropriate for foreign journalists to interfere and speculate on what Ukrainians want from their own country. I'm also filming the Donbass situation at the moment. Now, this is not inappropriate at all for a foreign journalist acting as a foreign correspondent to speak about what is going on. And my question to this would be, are you with the Ukrainian people or are you with the Ukrainian government? Because if it's what the Ukrainian people want, you should, as a activist here, you should be pushing their voices as much as possible. Or are you with the government who's trying to then push this down? And as I say, sunlight is the best disinfectant, and you can be a very positive part in this. Or is it more that the narrative about Zelensky being Churchill and his crew is falling apart? So it's inappropriate to speculate on internal politics of a foreign state. Well, no issue doing it to many other states and making completely false statements, especially around things like conscription. So again, a lot of people, I would ask, are you with the Ukrainian people? Are you a voice for the Ukrainian people or a voice for the Ukrainian state? And you should put those glasses on when analysing people you are listening to. And as I've always said, I'm first and foremost for the survival of civilians and the reduced suffering of those men fighting at the front lines. And very far down the list is the pushing of government narratives, propaganda, information that has no space for me at all. Of course, I know governments represent the people, but it's not representing the people when you've got those by the thousands marching on the street. And Zelensky, he has somewhat walked back on the catastrophic bill that he put forward. My bill's already in the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, fulfilling my promise, fully fledged guarantees of the independence of corruption agencies, real opportunities to verify that any Russian interference is kept out. So saying that it will be then independent. Everyone who has access to state secrets, and this includes not only the NABU and SAPO, these are the anti-corruption, but also SBI, National Police, must undergo detector tests, must be regular checks. The bill contains provisions to prevent various abuses, and there was proposals from partners in Europe. Keir Starmer said this too. I spoke with then the leader, the Chancellor of Germany, informed him already approved the bill guaranteeing independence and effectiveness, no interference from Russian influence, and an expert review of the bill. Britain, Germany, as well, they've reached out on this. And it is somewhat that Zelensky is walking back, but not after there was huge street protests and very stern comments from allies. Lindsey Graham said one of the most widely used talking points for ending support to Ukraine is that it was awash with corruption. And this has showed that even more. Now, what I see with this is it's still citing then Russian influence. The problem with this, and I'm not saying that there is an influence in this, is Ukraine can do what I call doing an EU or doing an Obama, and you can cite Russian interference regardless of how big or small it may be, and then you can take complete control. We've seen this happen to, of course, President Trump. We've seen it happen to those running for leadership positions in Europe, that what you do is, regardless of how big or small or fabricated it is, you cite, oh, there was Russian interference, throw it all in the bin, while there's no actual definition of Russian interference. And in some of the elections in Europe, what J.D. Vance talked about was maybe there was $250,000 of interference, maybe through TikTok here, but you can throw out the entire thing of that. And what then you can do is you can fabricate that and throw it all out. And in my opinion, Zelensky's damage is done. With the heavy-handed arrests of these guys for really nothing through, I think the damage and credibility is completely done as we see this slide into further centralisation and authoritarianism. And it's not even the slide, it's now becoming just more mainstream accepted. And remember, when if you mention corruption, you mentioned then not having elections, or that there was some concern about slipping into authoritarianism of who's making the shots, it was a talking point, it was a Kremlin talking point, you're Putin's best mate, etc., etc., etc. But now it's becoming more mainstream to talk about, and we see this slide of the media preparing as well, whilst the reality comes to the forefront. And what I say again, for these people that are more activist than analyst, are you with the people or the government? Because that decision may come. And someone we do need to speak about is the head of the president's office, Mr. Yermak, the polarising power of Andrew Yermak, Ukraine's other wartime leader. President Zelensky's far right-hand man is fueling concerns over creeping authoritarianism. And this was from the Financial Times. Now, what we are going to do is I'm going to go through then 14 slides on this, and then we're going to set just the foundation for what I speak about in my conclusions here around centralising around a single figure and outmanoeuvring command who's there for checks and balances, being a shadow president, and what may become in the future, what we are seeing, and the issues that this is going to arise in negotiations, in further military actions, and the governance of trying to join NATO, EU, etc. So that's going to be the conclusion. Now, if you've read the article, skip forward 10 or 15 minutes and wait till you see maybe this slide, and then you'll get an idea of my views on it. The world knows Zelensky as the comedian turned wartime president who has become the most recognised political figures of the 21st century. People will draw the comparison of Churchill. The burly man standing at Zelensky's left shoulder in the video is not a household name, although he appears in countless images. This is Mr. Yermak, who has incredible power and influence. But among Ukraine's foreign leaders and diplomats, he is a person of immense and polarising influence, although being unelected and with very little accountability or with no background, especially in military affairs. Andrew Yermak is not Ukraine's president, but he often acts like one. As the head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, his official title, he drafts peace plans, directs back-channel diplomacy, and handpicks government officials. The Prime Minister and top military brass frequently defer to him. When it comes to high-stakes negotiations, prisoner swaps, the return of abducted Ukrainian children, deals to keep grain flowing through the Black Sea, Yermak runs the show. He's on first-name terms with global power brokers and Hollywood stars. Who cares about the Hollywood stars? Inside the gilded hall of Kyiv's presidential compound, Yermak oversees a tight-knit team of around 24 personally selected devout advisors who enjoy access to national security briefings and meetings with visiting heads of state, an arrangement considered highly unorthodox by most Western governments' standards. Zelensky's right-hand man to Ukraine's de facto vice president. This is the way it has moved, but allies and critics agree. Almost nothing happens in Ukraine without knowledge and approval. Nobody gets the president without going through him. So if he's the one who's selecting who Zelensky sees, who Zelensky talks to, etc., then you have de facto shadow government. To staunch supporters, such as Andrew Sybiha, Yermak's former deputy who has served as Ukraine's foreign minister since September, Yermak is a great manager, especially in crisis situations. But his judgment has been called into question by many observers, including those close to him. It was Yermak who, against the advice of US and Ukrainian officials, pushed for an Oval Office meeting with Donald Trump in February. And we know how that went. People have spoken about his micromanagement, saying he tries to be everywhere and to do everything. And this is from Alexander Rodnyansky, a Ukrainian TV executive and an old friend of Yermak's. Yermak has come to personify a debate roiling the country on whether centralised powers imposed by the wartime administration might cripple Ukraine's democratic future once the war ends, or while the war is going on as well. This is very, very vulnerable at this point. For many Ukrainians, he's a symbol of an old order they're desperate to leave behind. These pseudo-oligarchs. This week, Zelensky, and scratching each other's backs. This week, Zelensky faced the most serious domestic challenge of his presidency after a sweeping move to sideline Ukraine's independent anti-corruption bodies sparked the first major mass protest since the start of the war. There were chants of Yermak out and fuck Yermak amongst the crowds of thousands gathered in Kyiv. But again, if you're a foreign journalist, analyst, activist, don't speak about it. You're not allowed to, or it's not your place to, and it is exactly your place to while people are fighting for democracy and dying on the front lines. I interviewed more than 40 people, including current and former Ukrainian officials. I was frequently told that he wields as much influence as Zelensky, or perhaps more. To detractors, Yermak is an unelected czar amassing boundless power, eroding the democratic checks and balances that Kyiv has implemented since its Euromaidan revolution in 2014. He draws up lists of domestic political enemies for Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council to sanction. So who is actually checking on who are you sanctioning, targeting, threatening, etc.? He's been accused of manipulating judicial investigations to discredit his rivals and stalling anti-corruption inquiries. He is said to orchestrate black operations, spreading leaks and rumours via anonymous channels on Telegram. His aim is to centralise everything in a post-Soviet style rule that resembles something not so different from autocracy, exactly what many are saying they are fighting against, while some with large platforms say it's not their place to speak about. Last week, one of Yermak's close allies, Yulia, I can't pronounce that last name, was appointed Ukraine's new prime minister. Of course, this massive shake-up in Ukraine's upper echelon of politicians right before Zelensky made those decisions to go after the anti-corruption bureaus looking into those exact people. A move widely reported as evidence of his growing hold over Zelensky. A Western ambassador described it as Yermak's role bluntly. He's the president, the prime minister, the foreign minister, all the ministers put together. One Ukrainian minister warned me that few inside the government would dare talk about Yermak on the record, a prediction that turned out to be true. Everyone's future and fortunes are determined by Andriy Yermak. And of course, we go back a slide and we talk about list of national domestic political enemies for National Security Defense Council to sanction, and some of those institutions in Ukraine work vastly different to they do in the Western states, and more like the KGB used to operate. Yermak's allies argue that he is not a grey cardinal lurking and shaping policy in the shadows, but something new in Ukraine's post-Soviet political world, a green cardinal commanding private and public stages in his olive combat fatigues. Well, at least the drip is ready for dictatorship. In early 2019, he took a step into politics, joining Zelensky's presidential campaign. Zelensky appointed Yermak to top aide on international affairs. Even those close to the president were surprised. Zelensky's team was mostly composed of friends he'd known since school days. Of Zelensky's most ambitious promises, including ending the war, this is why he was voted in, was to ending the war. In the first test of political acumen, that summer, Yermak became the main point of contact between Kyiv and the US President Donald Trump's circle, as American officials pressured Ukraine to open investigations into alleged corruption by Trump's Democratic rival Joe Biden and his son Hunter. Acting as a back channel to Trump's personal lawyer Rudy Giuliani, Yermak discussed possible statement of cooperation, and we will never truly know between the crackhead of Hunter Biden and Ukraine involvement. The condition for the White House meeting and the release of $400 million in US military aid, the negotiation led to Trump's infamous do us a favour call. The episode marked the start of Yermak's evolution into the president's top fixer. And we see there's a lot of movement of people around that benefit Yermak and hide other checks and balances. According to 2 Ukrainian officials involved in military planning, Yermak has overruled military leadership on several occasions and in certain situations had full influence over battlefield operations. One of the most glaring examples, they said, was his influence over the Battle of Bakhmut. And it should be known, Yermak has zero military background, is making executive decisions over battles, and especially Bakhmut, that was absolutely catastrophic. Bakhmut, it became a symbol of Ukraine's unbreakable resistance. Zelensky too wanted a major battlefield victory to lift national morale. Bakhmut wouldn't fall, and it couldn't. But we did see the outcome of Bakhmut and the huge cost. Behind the scenes, Western officials were alarmed by the casualties. And we know from people on the ground, the casualties that people were saying were completely fabricated about the casualty rates in Bakhmut, while you're surrounded on 3 sides and the logistic routes are completely under fire. Ukrainian commanders complained resources were being wasted for little tactical return, and then people on this website and Twitter and Telegram refused to report on that. And that's why I believe many, many bloggers have blood on their hands. If you are not reporting realistically what people are saying off the front line, therefore none of these people have any accountability from the commanders to the politicians, you are siding with the government and their goals rather than the actual people you so vehemently say that you are supporting. Many said the decision to stay had been made inside the president's inner circle, not by the military. A political manoeuvre disguised as heroism is exactly what we have said about military operations need to be supported by propaganda. Propaganda can't support military operations. The men were thrown into the fire of a failing cauldron for then a political manoeuvre at best. In the end, the Bakhmut fortress fell. The toll would undermine Ukraine's 23 counteroffensive, which also ended in failure. It was a mistake to stay in Bakhmut so long, and it came from the president's office. You can guess who. Relations hadn't improved much by Yermak's latest trip to Washington last month. One of the White House Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, never materialised the meeting they were meant to have. They met in a hallway walking past each other. One person briefed the interaction. As Wiles moved on, Yermak managed a single sentence. I want to say we're winning the war. An attempt to meet Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio went only slightly better. Vance's team gave him the cold shoulder. It was a disaster. At a meeting in Saudi Arabia in March, an agreement between Ukrainian and US officials over Trump's proposed 30-day ceasefire with Russia nearly collapsed because Yermak refused to sign. It took a last-minute back-channel effort by Waltz to reach Zelensky directly. When Ukrainian president got Yermak on the phone, his message was clear. Agree to the ceasefire, so operating independently and somewhat over the somewhat elected president, or the elected president of the time. Now we know that that has then expired. Yermak has managed the unusual feat of irking US politicians on both sides of the aisle. And we do hear a lot of murmurs that the US want Yermak out. The only reason Budanov is still there is because of the US, but Zelensky is refusing to then move Yermak on, and that Budanov is a real threat. He makes everything harder than it needs to be. He doesn't generate any creative ideas. He also tends to make it about himself, said one former US official briefed on the trip. One of the sharpest criticisms is that he sometimes doesn't seem genuinely interested in his own country. It's all about inserting himself in the centre of decision-making to the point where he actively harms Zelensky and Ukraine. And many point to the name-dropping of Hollywood figures and wishing happy birthdays to them, etc. The others said the summit and predecessor to the Boston Airport were ill-conceived. That the Swiss Alps summit in Bergenstock that we spoke about, exactly like we said, was a PR show. I'm glad one Western ambassador has spoken about this, considering Russia and China were not involved. And as we said at that, if Russia and China were not involved in this, don't waste the jet fuel going there. Unfortunately, often Andrew would focus on things that I don't think were critical to them winning the war, said a US official who worked with him. More than one Western official cited Yermak's alleged connection to anonymous Telegram channels, such as Vertical, Joker, and the House of Cards, that have repeatedly attacked his critics. Yermak has denied any involvement with these channels. Certainly, Yermak seems never far from controversy. Some critics have focused their attention on Oleg Tatarov, one of Yermak's closest allies inside the government, who has been the subject of multiple journalistic investigations alleging corruption and abuse of power. Though charged in 2020 over an alleged bribery scheme, the case was eventually dropped. I wonder why. And then you're clamping down on any anti-corruption agencies. I'd like to know who's driving that. They claim Tatarov acts as Yermak's enforcer, offering protection and quietly exerting control over Ukraine's vast security and law enforcement agencies. That control, they say, has put pressure on anti-corruption investigators. Yeah, gun to their head, unlocking their phones for nothing we have heard about, stalled prosecutions and border selective enforcement that shields allies while keeping opponents in check. Meanwhile, those that say they stand up for the Ukrainian people say that it's not their place to speak about. Several high-profile cases have mysteriously lost momentum once they reach the agencies of Tatarov's orbit. Shock horror. An accusation which Yermak is known to be sensitive about, his younger brother Denis, a businessman who has been the focal point of several corruption allegations. Denis has denied all the allegations made against him, and Yermak tried to have Budanov removed. Budanov is a huge threat to the power circles. We know that he's apparently very liked by Western politicians, and just like what's his name, Zelensky, does present a real problem. And we have heard that the only reason Budanov is still around is because of the US. Oleh Rabachuk knows what it means to be the man behind the throne. If Chief of Staff to Viktor Yushchenko, Ukraine's third head of state from 05 to 06, he occupied the same position Yermak holds today. In theory, their responsibilities were identical. In reality, they're very different. There's now no path to Zelensky that bypasses Yermak, and that's the problem. So to speak to Zelensky, to do anything, you have to go through Yermak. And of course, he can chop and choose and set the environment of who Zelensky speaks to. Rabachuk pointed to the dismissals of Valery Zaluzhny, Ukraine's popular former commander-in-chief, Dmitry Kuleba, Zelensky's wartime foreign minister, Alexander Kubrakov, and reform-minded infrastructure minister. According to two former Ukrainian officials, Yermak oversaw the dismissal of Zaluzhny, as well as his PR chief, this gentleman here. So you can see, creating this inner friendly circle. Zaluzhny's fate was sealed following what many viewed as unusually blunt assessment of Ukraine's war prospects in autumn 23. There will most likely be no deep and beautiful breakthrough. Zelensky also said we need 500,000 men mobilised, and he's correct on both of those. Kuleba, an affable politician and diplomat, was also deemed too popular. So if you're deemed too popular, you are moved on. Rabachuk described the presidential office as a largely closed system that prizes loyalty over competence. And it sounds like you're surrounding with a bunch of loyal yes men rather than competent questioners, much like a lot of people's audiences. Zelensky doesn't want to be burdened with complexity. He wants quick, simple solutions. Yermak provides that. Talk about Zelensky and you're talking about Yermak. Talk about Yermak and it's Zelensky. They've become one. Even so, Rabachuk added, Zelensky has a mandate to lead. Yermak has none. And yet he makes decisions that override ministers, leads diplomatic delegations, and speaks for the state. It's a big constitutional question in our country. In his view, Yermak's genius, it isn't governance. Yermak is the first to whisper it to Zelensky if someone is gaining popularity. He knows exactly what to say and when to say it. To eliminate political threats, he makes it seem like he's protecting Zelensky, but really he's weakening him. And if you're not willing to have people that push back who are competent against you, you are being weakened. And at this point in time, the threat of internal stability breaking down is a higher threat than the front line breaking down. Some believe Zelensky's decisions are catching up with him. While he remains popular, his approval ratings are trending downwards. And I'll say this, you always pay the piper. And these decisions, they are catching up with you. It doesn't matter if you control all the media, control all the people. Eventually, the truth will see through. Well, I hope that it will. Among those who said they distrusted the president, more than 80% saw signs of creeping authoritarianism. People in Ukraine can probably see this a lot better than Westerners, especially those that lived under Soviet rule. Over the past months, Yermak has been working on a crowning project of sorts, the biggest reshuffle of Ukraine's cabinet of ministers since the start of the war, and those very, very friendly to himself. Again, are they based on competence or loyalty and relationships? The new Prime Minister's most defining asset may be her unwavering loyalty to Zelensky. this was the biggest shuffle that we saw, but it was the biggest shuffle in the days before Zelensky cracked down on the anti-corruption bureaus, and to his powerful chief of staff. You can't run a country on instincts, Rabachak said. You need structure, institutions, strategy. This is what's missing. Yermak and Zelensky, they've eliminated any viable competition for now. But after the war, the reckoning will come. It'd be interesting to see when there actually is democracy, or if there is democracy and there is a democratic vote, who the people actually vote for, because we know Zelensky is nowhere near as popular as NAFO like to make him out to be, or as Western politicians like to make him out to be. And if we see a real reformer come in, what will become of some of these decisions made, or if it will just all be swept under the rug again, like many previous instances. And what I will say in conclusion, Ukraine's leadership is increasingly centralised around a single figure. Yermak and Zelensky, they have become one. Yermak, of course, being completely unelected, Zelensky now working as an unelected official, refusing to have then elections. I know it's not that they constitutionally they don't have to, etc., but at this point in time, you can say that neither is elected into that position, working as one and further centralising the government around a single figure, even if that single figure is both of them. Yermak has then manoeuvred himself into a position of unchecked influence, even influencing political decisions and massively influencing the president. If you can't get to the president without going through him, if you're raising a problem somewhere, if you're in the upper echelon here and you can't, he's been completely, he sets an environment, a pseudo-environment around Zelensky. And this is where some have said that Zelensky is only getting fed some of the information. And this article, this isn't a profile on Yermak. It's a warning. It's a warning that Ukraine is drifting into autocracy and internally that Ukraine is tightening control and censoring opposition. And it's not that this is happening now. It's just being exposed now. Yermak, he's not a chief of staff. He's a shadow president. He controls who sees Zelensky. He overrules the military. He makes battlefield decisions without being a militaryman. He picks government ministers, and he's accused of interfering with the courts and anti-corruption efforts. Like I said, there is now no path to Zelensky that bypasses Yermak. So you could make the claim that he is more powerful or has more influence than Zelensky. And what we're watching right now, it isn't just centralisation. It's the early stages of a full-blown power vacuum. One that's being actively created and bubbling away now for some time. The institutions in Kyiv are being stripped down, and anyone with independent influence has been removed, sidelined or threatened, and those with an audience, I guess, are too scared to talk about this or doesn't fit the narrative. And what's being left is a hollowed-out system where loyalty matters more than competence. There's no real political opposition, or it's been banned. So there's no functioning checks or balances, and a lot of the media is not willing to do that to bring sunlight as disinfectant. Ukraine has some incredibly difficult days ahead. Ukraine's toughest days remain in the future, not in the past. This is not only militarily, but politically. The lofty visions of victory and calling the shots against Putin in a position of power, these are all but gone. And at some point, some hard meetings, some hard decisions will take place. And I sure as shit hope that it's not just loyalty and yes men, that there's real competence there, because the US administration will see right through that. Creeping authoritarianism and unchecked power at the top, it doesn't just threaten Ukraine internally and the future of Ukrainians. It also risks the path to Western institutions like NATO or the EU, and Brussels and Washington, regardless of what they say publicly, they are not blind. And if this continues, the path and the doorway to NATO and the EU, it won't be closed by Putin. It may be closed internally due to decisions made. And this kind of governance can and will be exploited by Putin. If you've got two sides you're looking to go, the liberal checks and balances way of the West, or the more authoritarian, scratching each other's backs, enriching each other of what sits to Ukraine's east. And that will be exploited. And you may see, there's been people say Yermak's working as an agent of Russia. Now, I don't believe that. I'm not making that claim. But you can see where these people, that when it comes to it, go, shit, well, all this might come out if we end on this turn. And Russia and Russian influence that we spoke of, that citing any influence can then upturn everything. Well, this is the problem, is if that influence or influence is cited, even if it cites something that is actually happening. If Russian propaganda says Ukraine is corrupt, and then I say Ukraine is corruption, is that Russian influence? Am I working as an agent for the state? But that's how little you could then cite it and go, yep, bang, there you go. But Russia doesn't need to fabricate much when the Ukrainian leadership is consolidating power and silencing opposition. And this is happening whilst that influence saying that. Therefore, you can cite and shut down all these agencies that are meant to be doing the checks and balances. It's a massive, massive concern, as I've shown you, that many don't want to speak about, even though it's exactly the position of what they should be speaking about. And are you there for the people legitimately fighting whose futures are hanging in the balance, or dick riding those who are already rich, who aren't going to the front line, whose children aren't going to the front line, who aren't fighting and will find themselves in a villa in Monaco, regardless of how this war goes? I know who I stand with, but I'm very unsure who many, many others stand with. I hope that you have a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.